Today's lesson is Lesson 19, the War of 1812. America stood up to Britain and triumphed in the Revolutionary War, but time had not softened their relationship. In 1812, the conflict that had been brewing erupted in all-out war once again. The War of 1812 is sometimes called the Second War for Independence because America had to stand up to oppression by the British for the second time in 30 years. Three significant complaints led the United States to enter into the War of 1812. Impressment. Britain's Royal Navy had a difficult time recruiting enough members, so they adopted a habit of impressment. Navy vessels captured American trade ships bound for ports around the world and forced their crew to join the Navy. The British justified this by saying they only took men who had previously abandoned the Navy, but this was not always true. Impressment was not only a violation of the Americans' human rights, but it was another example of British refusal to take the American Republic seriously. Number 2, conflict in the West. The United States was a young nation. One of the reasons many were in favor of war was to prove their strength to more established world powers, such as England and France. As more and more settlers headed west, conflicts with indigenous peoples over territory continued. The British saw that an opportunity to hinder American growth by taking the side of the Indians. They decided to supply them with weapons to support the Indians' fight against the American settlers. The British stance was seen as betrayal by many Americans who wanted to declare war in retribution. 3. Trade troubles. At this point, France and England had been in conflict for several years, and the United States had worked hard to remain neutral. Britain and France were trying to weaken one another's power by setting up restrictions on trade. The United States was drawn into conflict when France and Britain issued opposite orders. Britain ordered the United States to stop and pay a toll at British ports when trading with France, while France ordered them not to stop at British ports. Either way, they couldn't make anyone happy. The economy of the country was seriously affected by these restrictions, and many felt that again the rights of Americans were being abused. There were some disagreement among Americans about whether these complaints were serious enough to go to war over. George Washington had warned against entering into international conflict due to the huge expense and instability it would cause the young government. Thomas Jefferson followed suit and stayed neutral at all costs. In 1809, a new president was elected, James Madison. He was hesitant to go to war as well, but a vocal group in Congress convinced him the only choice America had was to stand up for its rights and declare war. In June of 1812, Madison made history by asking Congress to declare war for the first time. Less than 30 years after the Revolutionary War, America and Britain opposed each other once again. Hawks plus Doves. These were two distinct groups in Congress, those who felt action was necessary, the War Hawks, and those who wanted to remain neutral, referred to as the Peace Doves. Hawks generally represented the southern and western area of the country, where expansion was being affected by conflict with British indigenous allies. Doves were mainly from the New England states, where international trade was a mainstay for their economy. They didn't want to lose their livelihood by going to war. Eventually, the Hawks were able to persuade President Madison their way was the right way. The Americans' first plan was to invade Canada and capture British territory to use as collateral. They were confident and ready to make their move, but they were quickly chased back across the border by British soldiers and their indigenous allies without any shots fired. Instead of gaining land as they'd planned, they lost much of the Northwest Territory, including the city of Detroit, which they surrendered. Their earlier failures were partly due to the lack of unity among the American people. The Peace Doves of New England had not changed their mind with regard to war in these states and those states, and the ones with the most wealth and resources refused to participate in the effort. During this early fighting in Canada, militias from northern states would not even cross the border, so in a few cases the battle was over before it even began. Battles of Lake Erie and the Thames, September plus October 1813. After a disappointing start to the war, America began to gain ground in 1813. Two victories at the Battle of Lake Erie and the Battle of Thames renewed their confidence. The United States took back the city of Detroit in a naval battle on Lake Erie. They pursued the retreating British and engaged with them and some of their indigenous allies on the banks of the Thames River. The British were outnumbered and easily beaten. It was a significant event because of the death of the Shawnee chief, a man named Tamasul. Tamasul was a Shawnee, a North American indigenous people group, in other words, an Indian, war chief who was a charismatic and well-respected leader. He was fiercely dedicated to retaining the Indian lands for his people and fought to resist American settlement until the day he died. He organized an alliance of Indian groups and joined the British to counter the efforts of the Americans in the Northwest Territory, which is the Great Lakes area. His death deflated the indigenous people's resistance to American settlers and ended their alliance with Britain against the United States. The burning of Washington on August 1814. The war between Britain and France finally came to an end. The portion of the British army had been occupied fighting the French was now available. As you might imagine, this was very bad news for the Americans. The newly reinforced British army planned a simultaneous attack on 3 different parts of the United States: northern New York, New Orleans in the southern end of the country, where they hoped to gain control of that Mississippi River, and the Chesapeake Bay near Washington, D.C. Their first invasion was on the nation's capital. British forces took the city easily, burning much of it to the ground, including the White House, then called the Executive Mansion, and Capitol Building. It was a devastating blow to the American morale. Their capital was destroyed, and they were very close to running out of money. Worse yet, the British were on the move again. After their easy success in Washington, D.C., the British decided to move forward and attack the port of Baltimore on the other side of Chesapeake Bay. The Battle of Baltimore, September 12th through 14th, 1814. Baltimore, Maryland were especially important to the United States because it was the center of shipbuilding. The Americans knew that if the British captured the city, the loss of so many ships would be devastating to the trade industry for years to come. The commanding officer in Baltimore was Major General Samuel Smith. He called the entire population of the city to do what they could do to prevent the British from taking the city. They dug trenches for battle, and ships were sunk in the harbor, which might leave you wondering how that would possibly help. The idea was that when British ships sailed in, they would run into the submerged ship and get stuck. The Americans would stop at nothing. The sunken ships worked as intended, and British ships were unable to enter the harbor. They were, however, able to get within cannon range, but the Americans held Fort Henry even though 25 long hours of bombing from the British. An American lawyer named Francis Scott Key was watching the drama unfold from a ship in the harbor. As the sun rose on September 14th, he looked up to see the huge American flag still flying on the walls of Fort McHenry. He was moved to write a poem he called Defense of Fort McHenry. It was later set to music, and its name was changed to the Star-Spangled Banner. In 1931, it became the national anthem of the United States. And that's a very important point. So pay attention to how that all came about. The Battle of Baltimore marked a turning point in the war. Families were tired of running farms and shops without the men who were fighting in the war. Finances were dwindling, both for the individual families and the country as a whole. 5 months of peace talks ended in the signing of a treaty in Ghent, Belgium, on December 24th, 1814. Unfortunately, because of the slow communication of the time, news of peace didn't reach the United States until February of 1815. And another battle occurred in the meantime. Casualties, soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in the Battle of New Orleans were more than 2,000, and it was technically fought while the two countries were no longer at war. Peace was restored, but strangely, the treaty didn't actually alter any of the issues the American had with Britain. To begin with, Britain and America territory was given back. British and American territory was given back. Impressment continued, and both sides even believed they had won. It was called the Second War for Independence of America. While nothing had really changed, America had a new sense of confidence. For an activity break, there have been many renditions of the Star-Spangled Banner sung over the years. See if you can find a performer you like singing it, and then listen to it while imagining yourself in the scene of Francis Scott Key. In your Let's Talk About It, it says to look back at the beginning of the lesson for 3 reasons the American went to war. Do you think the war was worth it? What did it accomplish, and what did it cost? And that concludes Lesson 19 for today.